Hello and welcome to Let's Talk, the segment of Sludge games where the controllers are put down for just 1 second so we can discuss what we've been playing. A few months ago I discussed the comparisons between the original Crash Bandicoot game and the remake, as well as wondering if Stormy Ascent would be remade as a downloadable extra. Much to my surprise and delight, that actually did happen. Cheers Vicarious Visions, I lost 22 lives. I loved it. Today's episode is about Crash Bandicoot 2 and how one particular character's future roles could have made the Crash series much different had the main protagonist altered his tactics ever so slightly. So, the beginning of Crash 2 follows on from the ending of Crash 1, where Cortex is seen plummeting down from his airship after having his green laser bolts deflect back towards him by Crash's spin attack. Not only that, but his hoverboard has exploded, rendering Cortex completely helpless. Somehow, he survives that fall seemingly uninjured, and is even more fortunate to discover a crystal that is brimming with energy. 1 year later, at his probably newly constructed space station, he and his new right-hand man Dr. Engine, nice pun, discover that to maximise the power of the newly discovered crystal, they need 25 slave crystals which are scattered around various places. With no Earthbound operatives left, Cortex hatches an idea. He abducts his old nemesis Crash to help him find the crystals to, apparently, restrain the power of aligning planets to protect the Earth from being ripped apart. If there are any scientists watching this video, please present theories as to what the hell Neo is talking about. As it turns out, the real reason that Neo wanted the crystals in the first place is so that he can turn the Earth's inhabitants into his mindless slaves. Where the storyline gets particularly interesting is when Crash collects a gem for the first time. When that happens, one of his old flirts appears to try and convince him to collect the gems instead. The last time Nitrus Brio was seen, he got his head kicked in by Crash's shoes in Cortex's tower.
I was in the first game!
Despite this, however, he is sort of on Crash's side. Brio has his own personal vendetta against Cortex, possibly down to Neo taking the credit for inventing the Evolvo Ray, when it was in fact Brio who invented it, and he wants Crash to collect the gems so he can destroy Cortex and his space station. Wow, talk about vengeance. After Crash defeats Cortex, he is left to collect the gems, and once they're all collected, Nitrus Brio takes him to his laser beam setup with all 42 gems in place to activate it. With the coordinates set, the laser beam explodes the Cortex vortex, sending parts everywhere. This in turn marks the beginning of Crash 3, when some of the debris destroys a temple where the great Uka Uka has been held captive, resulting in his escape. But, here's a question. What happens if you collect the gems before you collect all the crystals? Well, it is possible to do this, but due to the storyline, nothing different happens. This is where my hypothesizing begins. When you collect the final crystal, Cortex shows up in the warp room in hologram form and laughs maniacally at Crash, obviously very pleased that his scheme is about to succeed. Let's assume that throughout the whole game, Cortex has been communicating with Crash from his space station, with Engine next to him. Just a quick side note to explain how Coco and Brio were able to project their own holograms to communicate with Crash. Coco has shown throughout the whole Crash series that she is an expert hacker, so she could have been able to communicate with Crash by hacking into Cortex's communication system. Or maybe she just found a new battery for her laptop. As for Brio, he would have invented his own communication system similar to Cortex's. After all, he did invent everything, including slinkies and endings. Anyway, back to the conjecture. A possible alternate storyline starts off with Crash collecting all 42 gems before all 25 crystals. The ending cutscene with Crash, Coco and Brio would still happen as normal, and Cortex's space station will be destroyed by the laser beam. With Cortex and Engine still inside! Remember, Cortex would still be in his space station waiting to communicate with Crash once the final crystals are collected. But if his space station suddenly receives an attack from Brio's laser beam, then his plans would have to be immediately altered. And when I say immediately, from the point when Crash activated the laser to the target being destroyed, it took just 7 seconds according to the cutscene. To put it simply, Cortex and Engine would be history. Not necessarily. Just before the Engine battle, Cortex informs Crash of Brio's intentions, and he puts on a rather worried tone. Although he lies to Crash about being forced to assist Brio for world domination, there was actually some truth in Cortex's statements. Brio was genuinely trying to kill him. It's definitely possible, therefore, that Cortex could have been keeping an eye on Brio from that moment onwards, so maybe he could have predicted the attack from his ex-henchman and had the chance to escape. So, what effects could this have had on future storylines? Well, whatever the outcome of Cortex, Uka Uka would still have been freed from his temple anyway, so that wouldn't have been any different. But let's assume first that Cortex wasn't able to escape from the explosion. When Uka Uka escaped, he called on Dr. Nefarious Tropy to assist both himself and Cortex in Crash 3, but with Cortex not around, Tropy would therefore become the main villain. Maybe in the whole series? Well, definitely not in Twinsanity, as the evil twins were the main antagonists and would have shown up at Insanity Island regardless of prior events. Speaking of Twinsanity, by the way, Tropy and Brio joining forces to extract the treasure from the 10th dimension would likely not have happened due to Tropy's more prominent role as main villain. Another thing that wouldn't have happened is the creation of Crash Bandicoot. He was created by Cortex shortly after Crash defeated him for the final time in Warped, and since those events never, theoretically, happened in this alternative storyline, Crunch would never have existed. On the other hand, if Cortex had survived the explosion, then it would be hard to imagine him not wanting to seek revenge on his former right-hand man, which in effect would further complicate his already complicated plans for world domination. How much the storyline would be affected depends on how much of a role Brio would play in the events after Crash 2. It's possible that Brio would join forces with Crash, Coco and Aku Aku in order to stave off Cortex's attacks, escalating into a full-blown war between these two crazy scientists. Other events that would be affected would be Brio never reuniting with Cortex in Mind Over Mutant. I still don't really understand how that happened. And teaming up with Tropy in Twinsanity would be even less likely than before. Generally though, what would happen in this scenario is a much more complicated explanation to get into, so I'll just say that it's all dependent on where Brio's true loyalties lie.
It makes no sense!
So those are some possible outcomes had a certain event in Cortex Strikes Back worked out differently than the actual storyline itself. It's all pure conjecture of course, and I'm sure some of you might have some theories of your own. If you are one of those, then you're more than welcome to post them down below. In the meantime, stay tuned, see you soon.